chill here. Ah, tired today. Okay. No energy. Oh.
Or for your points. A Shoppers Drug Mart exclusive. Restrictions apply. Offer valid in-store and online. Country jams. Stage the January right now. Get up to $10,000 in available cash purchase discounts on 2021 Sierra and Silverado 1500 or 9% financing.
Oops. What the heck did I do?
Enterprise. Instead of extending further support and reinforcements to rehabilitate the Tigray region, is unproductive and not constructive. Ethiopian soldiers are also accused of attacking humanitarian agencies. Coletta Njohi for CBC News in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
The humanitarian groups Coletta just mentioned have a dire warning about Ethiopia. Millions of people are at risk of starvation, and many say food aid is being blocked by Ethiopia's leadership. CBC's Joan Leishman has this part of the story.
The UN, the US, and a dozen other countries are appealing directly to Ethiopia's
Play bingo with my
silence the guns.
cake today.
Deteriorate in the northern province of Tigray. It is critical aid groups are allowed in, says Thompson Theory of the UN's World Food Program.
A ceasefire and unimpeded access are vital to reach all areas and all people who are desperately in need of life-saving support.
Tigray is mostly a farming region. With millions displaced by war, crops have not been planted or harvested. Soldiers have destroyed agricultural equipment, seed stocks, and fertilizer. The UN's humanitarian chief is accusing Ethiopia of using starvation as a weapon of war. The food program series says the signs are dire.
And almost a quarter of all children who were screened were found to be malnourished.
For many, this is a ghoulish reminder of one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 20th century. In the 1980s, 1 million Ethiopians died of starvation because drugs and blocked access for aid agencies.
We can again see widespread famine in Ethiopia this year.
USAID Sarah Charles recently warned the Senate committee that another famine is coming unless there's a ceasefire. Although more and more world leaders are repeating that to Ethiopia's prime minister, adding security forces in Tigray are what he
This is
calls
what I'm playing this
frontline
morning.
operations. Joan Leishman, CBC News, Toronto.
Donald Trump is being banned from Facebook until at least January 2023. Facebook announced it is extending the former president's ban on the social media platform. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki reacted to that news.
Feels pretty unlikely that the zebra is going to change the stripes over the next 2 years.
Donald Trump was locked out of his social media accounts following the January 6th riot in Washington. The 50th Juno weekend kicked off last night with a virtual opening night of awards. Among the highlights, a tribute to Canada's Indigenous communities by the rock group Crown Lands. their song The End of the Road, the Oshawa rock duo won Breakthrough Group of the Year. Brandon Toby took home Rap Recording of the Year, and Canadian producer Wonder Girl became the first Black woman to win a Producer of the Year award. The 50th Juno Award show happens tomorrow night across all of CBC's platforms, CBC Game, TV, and radio. It starts at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Let's World Report. I'm Marcia Young.
And now your forecast in northern Manitoba. Good morning, I'm Lauren Donnelly. In Thompson today, mainly cloudy, a 60% chance of showers late this afternoon with a risk of thunderstorm and a high of 18. Tonight, mainly cloudy, a low of 10. In the Pod today, increasing cloudiness, a 60% chance of showers late this morning and this afternoon, a risk of a thunderstorm and a high of 24. Tonight, mainly cloudy, small chance of showers and a low of 14. In Churchill today, mainly cloudy, a high of 9. And tonight, cloudy, rain beginning this evening, and a low of 4.
As a Catholic, I am deeply disappointed by the position that the Catholic Church has taken now and over the past many years.
As pressure mounts on the Trudeau government to act quickly and decisively to end violence against Indigenous women and girls, a renewed call for the Pope to finally apologize for the role the Catholic Church played in the abuse and disappearance of Indigenous children in residential schools. Good morning, I'm Chris Hall, and today on the House, we'll take an in-depth look at this week's federal response to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls with former Commissioner Marion Buller, Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett, and the co-chair of a group representing family and survivors. Then,
I think it's fair to say that we were not insensitive to the importance of considering Indigenous candidacies as well.
Cabinet Minister Dominic LeBlanc joins us to discuss the search for a new Governor General and how the short list of candidates is shaping up. And retired Supreme Court Justice Morris Fish is here to discuss his report calling for greater independence for the military justice system. But up first, truth, faith, and reconciliation is the federal response to the MMIWG inquiry. More talk than action. The House is now in session. In the space of just 1 week, Canadians saw the impact government policies have had on generations of Indigenous people. The confirmation of undocumented deaths at the Kamloops Indian Residential School and preliminary evidence of the remains of some 215 children on the site shocked this country. Then on Thursday, the federal government released its response to the 2019 final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It includes new commitments to reopen cold cases, to expand community-led healing programs, and to spend more money on Indigenous language and culture, infrastructure, health, and policing in Indigenous communities. But there are no timelines for these initiatives, and after 2 years of waiting, some Indigenous groups say they're losing faith that anything will change. With me now is Marion Buller. She served as Chief Commissioner of that National Inquiry. Welcome back to the House.
Good morning, Chris. I'm happy to be back.
We're very happy to have you. The federal government promised transformative change in responding to your inquiry's report. Now, 2 years later, what have they done to meet that commitment?
Chris, that's a good question. I've been wondering what the answer is myself. If they've been doing the things they say they're doing, and it's pretty hard to find out about them, and I've been trying to find out. They have made some changes with respect to child welfare on reserve. They've passed legislation regarding Indigenous languages, but doing much else than that, it's not entirely clear. And it's that transparency, that clarity that all of us need, because certainly the status quo is not acceptable anymore.
So what does that tell you about the commitment to really responding to end the violence against Indigenous women and girls?
It tells me that there isn't much of a commitment at this point to end the violence. By now, I had expected that there would be something actually working in place, because going back 2 years ago, it certainly sounded like the federal government at least was willing to take immediate steps to end the violence, and I thought that that work would start June 4th of 2019. And if they've been doing things to address systemic violence, then they're not telling us.
So as you look ahead, I mean, there is an implementation plan that's calling, and I understand what you said about not much has been done so far. What must that include to begin, at least, to address the underlying causes of the violence and to ensure that women and girls in Indigenous communities are safe?
The National Implementation Plan, if that's going to be what they call it, really has to set out who is going to do what by when, who is responsible for what actions and by when, timelines, budget amounts, that sort of thing. But it has to get to the root causes of the systemic violence. In other words, there has to be a decolonizing approach. There has to be self-determination by Indigenous people. There has to be a rights-based approach to handing back the things that the government took away from Indigenous people, such as governance, such as the rights to their own human security. We can't do band-aids anymore. That's just simply not good enough.
Could you give me an example or two of what specific timeline around which specific measure might be the one that would begin to make a difference in people's lives?
Well, right now, certainly, Indigenous people have no place to go to complain about Indigenous rights breaches in particular, but also human rights breaches. That's a meaningful process for them and an easy process for them. So what I would say, or what I would be looking for, is by, say, January 1st, 2022, the Indigenous and Human Rights Tribunal will be up and operating with at least one ombudsperson hired and sitting at a desk ready to take complaints.
I listened to a lot of the politicians responding to the recommendations and speaking Thursday at the event that marked the response to your work. And I heard Mark Miller, who is the Indigenous Services Minister, talking about you have to have truth. You have to know what the truth is to be able to have reconciliation. We heard Carolyn Bennett, the Indigenous Crown Relations Minister, also talking about building momentum to make sure that we eradicate the kinds of prejudice and the barriers that Indigenous people have felt and to address the need for restoring cultural identity and the like. These are words that other governments haven't said, yet I take from what you're saying that we're past that point and you need to see the actions.
Yes, we've talked. A lot of truth has come out through the witnesses at the National Inquiry and also, of course, at the TRC. It's all there. It's just Canada, as a nation state, hasn't chosen to really dig deep and do the reading and the work that's required. Certainly, public education is very important because we have to know what we're reconciling about. However, it's time to move past that and say, okay, this is what we need to do, Canada, and this is what we're going to do by when, and who's responsible to do it. If you read the Inuit Action Plan, they do exactly that. They say who's going to do what, who's responsible, and how they're building relationships. So it can happen, and the Inuit Action Plan is a good example of that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you, the Native Women's Association pulled out of this entire process and call it toxic and dysfunctional, and they referred to lateral bullying, and they released their own list of actions. And I know this is a big topic, but what does it tell Canadians who want to see progress made that there remains some difference of opinion about how best to do that?
I think the first step is for all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to understand that we're not all the same. The issues faced by Indigenous women and girls and Tuareg people in the north are entirely different than, say, the issues faced by Indigenous women and girls and Tuareg people here in the Lower Mainland. So don't expect a pan-Indigenous approach. Of course there'll be differences in opinion because we're not all the same.
Could I also ask you, because I know you have a personal experience with this, when you heard the news earlier this week about the findings at the Kamloops, or the potential findings at the Kamloops Residential School, what went through your mind?
Horror, of course, like everyone else in Canada. But my first response was only 215. I know there's more territory around the school that has to be searched, but the witnesses at the TRC, the witnesses at our hearings at the National Inquiry, all talked about children who never came home. In my own family, it's part of our history. My grandfather and I, and my brother as well, walked around the Battleford Industrial School where my grandfather went, and he pointed out so-and-so and so-and-so are buried under that tree. There was no marker, of course. So-and-so and so-and-so are under that bush or that tree over there. So it was no secret in our own family that there were kids who never came home and their grades aren't marked.
All right. I have to leave it there. Marion Buller, I appreciate your time as always. It's good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too. Thank you so much, Chris.
Marion Buller is the former Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. The action plan released this week came together after consultations with provincial and territorial governments, Indigenous organizations, and family members of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of them is Denise Pictou Maloney. She's a member of Savaganagani First Nation in Nova Scotia and co-chairs the National Family and Survivors Circle. Welcome to the House.
Thank you.
Are you satisfied with the plan that's been laid out by the federal government?
Yeah, our Family Survivor Circle came together as a initiative through Minister Bennett's office in response to the National Inquiry's 231 calls for justice and principles for change. So our role in this was to be an advisory group and to guide the process and best practices in making sure through the plan and the implementation process that families were engaged and centered in this process. So, it is a plan for now. They're words, not actions, and our real guide will be once we're on the ground and implementing the 231 calls for justice, the impact that it has on those directly affected.
There has been criticism by others who took part in Thursday's announcement that this plan was more like a plan to implement a plan. And I wonder what your response to those concerns are that were raised by some of the other groups.
Well, I think that, when you look at the history of this country and advocacy and activism, in particular with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the autonomy and the lived experience and expertise of families really hasn't been highlighted. It hasn't been put to the center. We had a lot of people doing work for families on the ground. We had families that testified during the National Inquiry that, there was a lot of appropriation happening, that families didn't feel like they were heard or that they had any kind of autonomy in choosing how they healed or how they moved through this process of, trying to find ways to really sustain themselves and be able to survive out there. So, everybody has a role in this to take accountability in making sure. I'm not on the East Coast. I wasn't contacted by anyone except for Minister Bennett's office to ask if I wanted to come and sit on this group to help guide this process. So, with change, it's not easy. You'll get pushback with change. But what we know is that our intent and our advocacy for families to be centered in this process comes from our hearts because we all lived through it and have our own lived experience.
I want to get to what I think is the theme of what the National Family and Survivor Circle were looking for, or is looking for. And it's around accountability, independent oversight, timelines for implementing the action plan, data. Those things